Hello, Swift students. I'm Professor John Gallagher, and thank you so much for letting me be part of your journey to learn to program using Swift and SwiftUI for iOS development. Now, by the end of this video, we'll lay out this simple SwiftUI screen while building a solid foundation for more learning. And while this video is a bit long, I've been teaching absolute beginners to build iOS apps for years, both in person and online, and hopefully you'll find my videos full of the kinds of tips, tricks, and learning that keep you on track and cut frustration. Now, at this point, I'm assuming that you've gone through the earlier part of this playlist covering how to download and install Apple's free Xcode software. That's the program that we're going to be using to build apps. And I'll also assume that you've got at least the free Apple developer account. You don't need the paid account for this course. But if you haven't gotten Xcode or the developer account set up, then see the earlier videos in the playlist. But if you're ready to start, let's roll. Now I dragged my Xcode into the dock, so I'll launch it by clicking the Xcode icon down here. Now here you see the version of Xcode that I used when I recorded this video, but Apple does regularly update Xcode, and sometimes they make changes to the user interface. Now if things have been moved around and they look different, I'll post a video on my playlist pointing out any differences in newer versions of Xcode, so if your Xcode looks radically different, check out the main playlist for update videos. Now on the welcome screen, select Create a New Xcode Project. I'll make Xcode full screen by clicking on the green traffic light in the upper left-hand corner. And now in this window, you see along the top we have options for building apps that are for macOS, watchOS, tvOS. Apple even has options to create apps across different platforms. But in the current tutorials, we're going to be focusing on iOS apps that work on the iPhone and iPad, so click iOS. Then under Application, we see the icon for App should be selected, and then click the Next button. Now here we're being asked to name our product. Most code tutorials start out with a project called Hello World. Now we're not going to have Hello World in this tutorial. In fact, Apple gives us the phrase Hello World by default in code we're about to see. We're going to change that, and I think it's awesome that you're learning to code, so let's name our first app You Are Awesome. Now when you name projects, it's a good idea to eliminate any spaces. I'll cover why in a later video, and you'll see that I've capitalized the first letters of the U, R, and Awesome. Now you'll also see a team name down here. It'll probably say personal team on it if you have a free Apple developer account. The organization identifier is likely com. Your last name. Apple uses this stuff to identify the apps that you build. And for interface, make sure that SwiftUI is selected. If you pull down this menu, you can also see that Storyboard is in here. Now, Storyboard is a technology used to create apps using Apple's older UIKit framework. For several years, I taught a class in app development using Storyboards and UIKit, and I still have all the content in my Zero to Full Stack UIKit course on my YouTube channel. It can be useful since most apps that have already been written have been built using UIKit, but this course focuses on Apple's newer framework, SwiftUI. So make sure that's selected. The language should say Swift. Now do not click Use Core Data or Include Tests. We won't be working on those with this app, and then click Next. Now this next box will ask you where you want to save your work. I'm going to save mine to the desktop. Do select Create Git Repository on my Mac. In a later video, we'll be talking about how to use Git and GitHub for saving versions of your code. Now also click on the Create button, and what we've just done is created a folder on the desktop that includes the initial files we're going to be using to start building our app. Now before we hop into our tour of Xcode, I actually want to quit Xcode because there are some important things to know about the project we've just created. Now I've saved my project on the desktop, so I see a folder named You Are Awesome, just as I've spelled it. And if I click inside this folder, I see another folder named You Are Awesome. Plus, I see a file that ends in .xcodeproj. Now this xcodeproj file is the file that you open if you ever quit Xcode and you want to get back into a project to continue your work. Now in the first few apps that we build, the xcodeproj file should be the only file that we open. Maybe you have your Finder in column format instead of list format, but you see the same thing, a You Are Awesome folder that's got another You Are Awesome folder in it, as well as youareawesome.xcodeproj. So the only file you should need access to is .xcodeproj. Open that to resume work on your project. Now, a very big and important warning. Do not rename any of these files, and also do not move the folder or any of the files inside while Xcode is open. It's unfortunate that Xcode projects are so fragile, but I've seen a lot of students run into problems thinking that they could simply rename a project by changing the file name. You can't do that with Xcode. I've also seen students create problems by moving folders and projects around while Xcode was still open. That can screw things up for you too. So do not rename files, do not move folders while Xcode is open. Now, one thing you can do, and which can be very useful while learning, is to make a copy of your current project. Maybe you want to experiment with techniques and make changes to the work that you've just done, but you don't want to impact the original work. Well, if you've quit Xcode, you can select your outermost project folder, not the inner one, and duplicate it. Command D is the Finder keyboard shortcut for duplicate, and now I have two projects on my desktop. This second one is a distinctly different project. Even if I click open the folder, I can see that the files inside both of these have the same names. It's the outer folder that matters. You can make changes on your new project, and it won't impact the original. So hopefully that'll help you understand what you've just created, but for now, I don't need this duplicate project, so I'm just going to throw it in the trash. Now back in my original project folder, you should never need to get into this second internal project folder. We can access everything we need directly from Xcode, but just to show you, if I click the expansion triangle on the You Are Awesome folder that's inside the outermost You Are Awesome folder, I see a bunch of names for files and folders that will be identical to items that we'll see in Xcode. So I see a file You Are Awesome app, a content view, an assets folder, and a preview content folder. Now I can collapse this folder, get back into Xcode by clicking You Are Awesome Xcode Proj. My You Are Awesome project loads in Xcode, and this column on the leftmost side, I see those same things that I just saw in the folder. You Are Awesome app, content view, an assets folder, and a preview content folder. Now first, a super quick tour of Xcode. The vertical column on the left is known as the navigator pane. Now when this first icon, the one that looks like a little folder, is highlighted, then you're in what's called the project navigator in the navigator pane. The project navigator shows the files and folders that are associated with your current project. These icons here have show hide triangles to the left, so if files aren't showing, you can click the triangle, it'll point downward, and it should expose any of the files that are inside of a folder or component. Now we see two files that are in here right now. The first one has our project name, You Are Awesome, followed by the word app, so let's click that one. Now most of this likely looks very unfamiliar, but no big deal, we're going to ignore it. But one bit of interest that we see in this very first file, in the center it says Content View. This is the place that Xcode sets up by default for us to begin coding the first screen in our SwiftUI project. This first file in our app will load and run another file in our app named Content View. That's the name Xcode gives this file by default. So why don't we find the Content View file in the Project Navigator and click that now. Now we're going to start changing the code here in just a moment, but also know that you don't always need to have the navigator's pane showing. It takes up screen real estate, and if you want to give yourself more room on screen, you can use this icon that's just to the right of the three traffic lights. By the way, as I hover my cursor over any of the icons that are in Xcode, you should notice that a tooltip shows up. This one says Hide or Show Navigator, so it tells me what this icon does, and when I click this, I can see that it toggles the left column open or closed. Now throughout our tutorials, I'll point out some keyboard shortcuts that I find useful. Hopefully you'll find them handy too. And our first keyboard shortcut is going to be Command plus 0. That's the number 0, not the letter O. So hold down the Command key, press 0, and each time you do that, you can see that the navigator pane will toggle between open and closed, just like it would if you clicked on the Hide Show Navigator icon. If you're eagle-eyed, when you press a keyboard shortcut, you might notice a menu briefly flash. If you pull down menus, you can see that shortcuts are listed just to the right of some of the menu items, and the shortcut that I've just typed in is under the View menu, Navigators, Hide Navigators. It shows Command plus 0 here, and the same code will show up Command plus 0 as Show Navigators when the navigator pane is hidden. Now if we go all the way to the right, we see an icon that looks like a flipped version of the Hide Show Navigators icon that we used over here on the left. Now hover our cursor over this icon on the right, and the tooltip says Hide Show the Inspectors. Now also notice there's a horizontal row of icons just below this Show Hide Inspectors icon. If you click on any of these, it will show a different inspector. We're going to work initially with this one called the Attributes Inspector. The Attributes Inspector is this one that looks like 3 lines that each have little slider circles in them. Now we're going to deal with that in just a bit, but for now, let's just click the button to hide the inspectors. We've maximized our screen real estate. And the second shortcut that I'm going to show you is to show or hide the inspectors pane. That's Option Command 0. So Command 0 would show or hide the navigator's pane on the left. Option Command 0 toggles the inspector's pane on the right. Now to the right we see the preview pane. It probably says preview paused. Now before we click on this resume button, let's select the kind of device that we want to simulate in the preview. Now you can do this by clicking right in the center of the toolbar, just to the right of where it says You Are Awesome. Now mine already says iPhone 13 Pro, yours might list a different device or even say My Mac or any iOS device, but when you click on this item, you should see a menu listing a selection of devices that you can simulate. I'm going to select iPhone 13 Pro. Feel free to choose your favorite device. If you want your screen to look exactly like mine, you can select iPhone 13 Pro or similarly sized device as well. And now I'm going to resume the preview by clicking on this circular arrow button. The first time you do this, it'll probably take a few seconds before you see anything. You'll see an activity indicator whirl. There are some messages that show up in the toolbar as well, but we'll eventually see the device in the preview on the right. Nice! Now my iPhone preview is a bit big, but you can pinch and zoom on your trackpad to resize the preview. You can also zoom with the minus and plus buttons in the lower right. I'm going to click the second button from the right, which is zoom to fit. And since I don't need all of this extra preview room, I can also click and drag the separator line that separates my code from the preview canvas so that I give myself some more coding space. Now, the first time you use Xcode, you might see some other things that take up space. For example, you might have a column like this in the center. This is called the minimap. It's a shrunken representation of the code you're currently viewing. Now, the minimap can be useful if you have a very long code file and you want to see where you are when you scroll through your code. There are some other tricks that we'll learn when we're working with larger files, but for now, let's just get rid of the minimap because it's taking up space and we don't need it. So to do that, we can simply select the middle icon of the three icons that you see over here in the far right in the upper right-hand corner. These are below the main toolbar Show Hide Inspectors icon. If you hover your cursor over this middle icon, it'll say Adjust Editor Options. Click that, it should open up a menu, and just make sure that minimap is not selected. If it is, deselect it. Now that's all the Xcode tour we need for now, so let's start building an app. Now on the left, we have the code from the content view file that Xcode creates for us whenever we create a new project. And then on the right over here, we see that we have an iPhone with an image of a blue globe and some text that says, Hello World. Now, if you look at the code on the left, you see the word image followed by system name globe. I bet you guess that puts the globe in there, and you'd be right. And below that is a line that says text, followed by the text, Hello World. Now, let's first look at this code that says text. Now, when we write text in SwiftUI, that's capital T and followed by parentheses, SwiftUI will write text on screen based on whatever we pass through those parentheses. Now, here we pass in the text between double quotes. It's highlighted in red on my Xcode. And in computing, a series of characters like this is called a string. So remember, whenever you hear the word string in computing, it refers to a string of characters. In Swift, we specify a string by surrounding the text in double quotes, and those are straight quotes, not curly quotes. Now, Hello World is painfully basic. I think it's awesome that you're learning to build apps, so let's change this so that it reads, You are awesome! Exclamation mark in between the double quotes, and look over to the right, the text has changed. Now, new coders, your first warning. Programming languages demand precision, and if I, by accident, delete the double quotation mark at the end, Xcode will eventually highlight this as an error. Now, this error isn't very new coder friendly. It says undetermined string literal, but we said strings in Swift are characters between double quotes. We have a starting double quote, but not an ending or terminating double quote, hence the error. You can even see that Xcode put a little underline under the first double quote as if to say, hey, I think you should start looking here for the problem. And remember, if you ever type something wrong and things look screwed up and you want to go back to where you were before, you can always undo. On the Mac, the shortcut for undo is Command-Z. You can keep pressing the undo shortcut until you're back at the spot before things got wonky. Now this text is very boring, so let's jazz it up a bit. First, I'm going to show you how we can do this with the Attributes Inspector. Now make sure the cursor is clicked somewhere on the same line where text is, and then to show the attributes for that text, I'm going to click on the Show Inspectors icon in the upper right-hand corner. The Attributes Inspector icon is selected, and this should show you the attributes that we can change for text. Now, a bit of a warning, sometimes Xcode is buggy, especially if you're using a beta version like I am. And if you can't see the Attributes Inspector, you can try showing and hiding the inspector's pane again. Hopefully it'll show up then. If Xcode is buggy on you, sometimes it can help to quit Xcode and restart it. But we'll also show you that Xcode provides lots of ways to get the same thing done. So here, we can also pull up the equivalent of the Attributes Inspector on the right by holding down the Control key plus the Option key and clicking on the word for text in our code. Now we can see that this displays a pop-up that looks almost identical to what we see on the right. The word text in the upper left-hand corner confirms these are the attributes for the text that we've clicked on, so feel free to use either of these options to change the attributes. Now, one of the options in here is font. So let's pull down this menu and see what we got. And these aren't the fonts that you usually access from, say, a word processor. Instead, they're Apple's system font choices. Now, while it is possible to access the other fonts that are available on your Mac, we're going to ignore that for now. Using these fonts has a few advantages, including a guarantee that they'll work well when using accessibility features, like increasing the type size of your iOS device. Now, for the font, since I've got bad eyesight and I very much want to loudly declare your awesomeness, I'm going to select the font Large Title. But before I let go, look at the code over here on the left. Once I select Large Title, Hey, Xcode, write some code for me. And I can see in the preview that the text "You are awesome" is now in larger type. Now this dot notation that you see in front of the word font, and there's no space between dot and font, means that font is a modifier. Font is a function or a little chunk of code that's modifying the user interface element above it. That user interface element is text. By the way, SwiftUI refers to user interface elements with the term view. An app's user interface element is made up of multiple views that work together. Each text is a view, each button is a view, an image is a view, pretty much anything you see on screen is a view. So in this case, a view, which is text, is being changed by the modifier, named font, which takes the input value, large title, which is the name of the specific font to be used when changing the font of text. Now don't get confused by the dot in front of large title. That doesn't mean that large title is a modifier function. This dot notation is also used to refer to some predefined data, and in this case, dot large title refers to Apple's large title font. More on that later. By the way, the dot padding that you see here, also a modifier. This adds the standard amount of padding around the text view. Now we just use the attributes inspector to have Xcode write code for us, but eventually you'll be comfortable enough to just start typing code in yourself. Let me show you how that works, and you should follow along too. First, let's highlight and delete the line Xcode just added for us. Then I'll backspace so that my cursor is just behind the close parenthesis on the text line. Now I'm going to press return, I'm on the new line, and then as I press period, this indents the cursor a bit more below the view. Now Xcode neatly formats modifiers at the dot so that they're indented slightly below each view, and now what you're about to see is a handy feature in Xcode called code completion. As I start to type, Xcode will look at what I've typed so far and suggest all of the options it knows about that have the characters that I've just typed. So .f reveals a bunch of options, .fo narrows it down further, .fon narrows it down even further, and we see some other help here. The M to the left of the list of options shows that these options are modifiers or functions that modify the view above it. And when you highlight one of these options, you see some documentation down below. You see a description at the very bottom, sets the default font for the text in the view, and remember our view is text, which you see right here. Also, this arrow with the word text after it means the font function is going to return a modified text view. And if I use the arrow key to move my cursor down to the next item in code completion, I've highlighted font weight. This is a modifier that sets the font weight of the text. You can think of that as being how bold a font is. We'll work with that in just a minute, but let's go back, use the arrow key to highlight that first option, .font, and press return. Xcode then types the .font command since that's what was highlighted when I pressed return, and the stuff highlighted in blue says that the font modifier that we just entered expects an input that indicates the type of font that we should use when modifying the text. Now we're going to ignore the colon and the question marks for now, but how do we know what we can put in here? Again, Xcode and code completion are your buddies. Dot notation is a way it'll help out. Type a dot, and gadzooks, my friends, we see a list of fonts that's the same as the list of fonts that was in the attributes inspector. Also, if you scroll down further in code completion, you'll see more modifiers, some that have parentheses after them. These are more advanced options that let you pass in some values to do things like set custom text fonts. Again, we'll ignore the complex stuff for now, but do feel free to try out some of the other font sizes that you see with dot notation to see how they look in preview. Now, using code completion can also be a great way to avoid typos. Let me show you an example of this. If I go ahead and type large title, .large title with a lowercase t instead of a capital T, I get an error. If you ever can't see the whole error, you can click on the little red circle and you should see the whole error underneath it. Type font has no member. Large title with a lowercase t. Xcode is saying, I don't know what this .large title is, all in lowercase. So if I backspace over it again, oh yeah, we need to add a capital T for title. Highlight this with the cursor if you need to. Press return. It's typed in, no typos, and the error goes away. Now, one nice thing about the attributes inspector is that fonts are arranged in mostly large to small order. And if you want any additional information on typography, Apple has a lot of material online. They have a set of documentation on the firm's human interface guidelines. Here I've searched for the phrase Apple User Interface Guidelines iOS fonts. The first thing to come up is the typography page of Apple's human interface guidelines. And if I scroll down, you can read choosing fonts to enhance your app, among other bits of useful advice. Feel free to explore this site more on your own. Now let's add another modifier. Over here in the Attributes Inspector, we can select font weight. I mentioned earlier that that refers to the thickness of the font's letters. And font weights aren't organized in this menu by thickness, but do try out the different weights. Ultralight is the thinnest, black is the thickest. Let's choose heavy, that's the second thickest. And hopefully you've noticed over here on the left-hand side, we have .font weight added to our code, and the dot value for any of the font weights we're passing in is also been entered automatically by the attributes inspector. Now, I also think that you should be comfortable coding directly, so why don't we highlight this line for a font weight that the attributes inspector just added for us, delete this, and we'll type it in directly. So when we get to the next line, we'll type in .fon, select font weight, press return. In this highlighted blue area, type dot. If you type HEA, you can see there's only one font weight with those letters in it that's heavy. Press return again. Nice, same result. Now let's add a text color. Now we could pull down the color menu in the attribute inspector, but let's see if we can type this code in from scratch. So let's press return to go to a new line, and if you're not sure what the modifier is, well, maybe it's .color for color, and oh wow, there are a lot of options with the word color in them. If you're not sure which one to choose, then we can press escape to get out of here and go back. Just know that the text attributes might not show up until you backspace all the way up to the last parenthesis in the font weight line above it. By the way, you notice the blue dots that are next to the font and weight attributes? The dots indicate that we've added those modifiers to our code. Now again, under color, we can select red, and we see the code is added that says .foreground color, in parentheses, capital C color .red. Okay, so we needed the .foreground color modifier. So to make sure that we can code this directly, which is what you'll eventually want to do, let's delete that foreground color line and retype it in. So press return. We can still say .color, but now we know which one to choose. We can use the arrow key to move down to .foreground color and see how the description of this modifier says that it sets the color of the text displayed by this view. There's lots of help built into Xcode. Xcode is your buddy. So with foreground color selected, press return. Xcode adds the needed parentheses. It says that we need a color. That's what this capital C color is in here. And we could type in capital C color to pick a color with dot notation after it. But Xcode also supports a shortcut where we can leave out the word color with a capital C and just start to type a dot and see a list of the predefined colors. That's because Xcode knows it can only accept a color data type here. So pressing dot reveals all those predefined colors. Feel free to try out some of these different colors, but I'm going to go back and select red to brightly declare your awesomeness. Now, I also want to point out that you can see a list of modifiers in an area of Xcode known as the library. So let's open the library. We want to click the plus sign in the upper right-hand corner. This will open the library's window. If you're not seeing the descriptive text to the right of the list of library elements, just click on this details icon right here. This row of horizontal icons shows the different elements that we can access in the library, and the search field also lists whatever area we're in. So initially, we're looking at views. The views we can add include buttons, color pickers, date pickers, and a whole lot more. But let's select the second icon in the horizontal icon list. It looks just like the attribute inspector icon, and when we click that, we see the text in the search field says that we're now looking at modifiers. And if we scroll down, you see a bunch of modifiers here. You can experiment with these on your own if you'd like, but many of them are a little too complex and you need to know more about them in order to set them up, so they're not super newbie friendly. But why don't you scroll all the way down to the text modifiers and find italic. That's an easy one to use. And when we select this, we can see in the description over here on the right that it gives us back modified text, and text is the view that we're using here. So I'm going to click and drag italic. I'll put it right after the foreground color red, and actually I'm going to click in front of the period before italic and press return, so these modifiers are all lined up nicely beneath each other. But will you look at that? We italicized our text. Now we also have this image up here, and we'll cover image views more in depth in future videos, but since we've got this one here, let's at least start to check things out. Now right now I'm clicked on one of the modifiers, the italic modifier, under the text view in my code. And the attributes inspector over on the right shows the text attributes. See the label text at the top of the inspector? But when I click on the image line in my code right here, the attributes inspector now shows image at the top, and it shows a subset of modifiers that can be applied to an image. So we see down here we've got something called render mode, aspect ratio, resizing information. There's image scale down here. It says large, but the image looks pretty small to me. What if we change this to small? Oh, that's really small. Nano image. And just as with text attributes, when we make a change to the image attributes, we see the changes in our code. See the word small in here? So let's undo that and go back to large. By the way, we can use dot notation to bring up the available options for image scale by backspacing over large. We see small, medium, and large. Let's go back to large, and how about we change the foreground color? It's blue, and now it says accent color in here. That's because the default accent color for iOS apps is blue. You'll notice in unmodified iOS apps, for example, that buttons are blue, and we can change the accent color, but for now, let's put a new color in here. We're going to backspace over the accent color, but leave the dot, and code completion gives us a whole list of colors to choose from. I'm going to select a cool mint. Nice. And now let's look at this word globe up here in the image where it says system image. And unsurprisingly, this shows an image of a globe. iOS actually has a few thousand built-in system images that we can use and customize. And we'll cover this in a future video. But for now, to celebrate your newfound Swiftiness, let's get rid of the globe between the double quotes and instead type Swift, S-W-I-F-T, all in lowercase. And look at that. Our new favorite bird is now in our app. Slick. Now, Apple's Swift logo is usually orange, so I'm going to go down to the dot foreground color modifier, and I'm going to change this to dot orange. Nice! Now, what if you want to make the image larger? Well, the Attributes Inspector shows a resizing mode. We could select this. There's a stretch option in here, but you'll see most developers will simply type in .resizable. So we're going to do that right underneath image. On the new line, I'll put in .resizable. Make sure you spell it right. And we don't have to put the .stretch parameter in between the parentheses since that's the default option. But great Caesar's ghost, will you look at that? Our bird is all stretched out. We don't want that gnarly Swift. But here's how to fix it. And again, we'll type this in since we want to learn the code statement since most professional developers don't rely on the Attributes Inspector. The modifier is scaled to fit. And if on the next line we just type in .scale, you see a couple of different options in here. We'll cover this more later, but .scale to fit, this first one here, says in code completion in the description that it scales the image to fit the parent. Now what it does is it keeps the original aspect ratio. That means the ratio of width to height. That's the bounding rectangle of the original image, meaning that even if the image scales to fit the available space, it will keep the original aspect ratio to prevent it from being distorted. And boom, will you look at that? Cue the Morris Day music because Swifter, you just did the bird. And if you don't know that song, you can look it up after the lesson if you care to funk. Now Swift is touching the edge of the screen. Let's add a bit of padding around the image, and we can do that with, you guessed it, the dot padding modifier. So type that in on a new line, press return. It accepts parameters, but if you delete the parameters between the parentheses, the default is to add a bit of padding around the entire image, top, left, right, and bottom. Now in the lower right-hand corner of the Attributes Inspector, you can get help with padding options if you want to. Select the options and Xcode will enter the code. So this is always useful for new SwiftUI developers if you don't remember what goes in the parentheses for the parameters here. So click on just the bottom square and the image only has padding on the bottom, no padding on the sides, and you see our code where it says dot padding changes so that in between the parentheses it now says dot bottom. Now check the right checkbox as well, and we see there are two values in parentheses now, dot bottom and dot trailing. Dot trailing refers to the right side, dot leading refers to the left side, and also note that these values are between square brackets separated by commas. No need to commit that to memory yet, but you'll eventually learn that syntax and why it's important. But for now, if you need help, you can pull up the Attributes Inspector. Now let's remove the bottom padding and click both the left and right boxes. And padding has dot horizontal as its parameter, and padding is only on the sides of the image. And if we remove everything between the parentheses, that's the same as if we were to check all of the boxes. That's the default that leaves a standard amount of padding around all four sides of a view. Now we can use the padding modifier on most views. You'll learn a lot more about this in future videos. You'll even learn how we can use numeric values to fine-tune our padding. Now this is a good place for us to take a break, and we didn't do a lot of coding in this first lesson, but we did cover a lot of important basics, including many topics that are often skipped over in many intro courses. We learned how Xcode projects are organized, how to reopen a project, and very important things to avoid when working with projects. We got a tour of Xcode, we discussed views and modifiers, we learned how to use modifiers to modify the text view, as well as how to modify an image view that had a system image inside it, and we learned to do this using both the Attribute Inspector and by writing the code ourselves. We learned a lot of important concepts about code completion, how to read a code completion description, and how to use dot notation to bring up modifiers or predefined values that hold useful data like colors and fonts. We got an introduction to the library, we deliberately created and fixed a couple of common errors that most new developers encounter, and we learned some of the most useful keyboard shortcuts and pro tips. I hope you're enjoying our time together. In our next video, we'll add some interactivity to our app by creating buttons. Keep hacking!